So let me make sure I'm hearing this the way it sounded in the room, because sometimes what's said matters less than how it lands. The president wasn't yelling, wasn't pounding the desk, wasn't playing the caricature everyone expects. It was calm, direct, almost conversational. The kind of tone that makes you lean in because you sense something serious is happening, whether you agree with it or not. He sat behind the resolute desk, leaning back, a document in his hand, and asked a question that didn't accuse so much as invite an explanation. And sometimes that's worse than an accusation, because explanations have a way of revealing things people never meant to say out loud. The silence that followed wasn't theatrical. It wasn't a pause for strategy or a dramatic beat for cameras. It was the kind of quiet that happens when someone realizes the conversation has moved into territory they didn't prepare for. Ilhan Omar sat across from him, in one of those chairs that usually signal respect, access, legitimacy. For most politicians, just being in that room is a victory lap, a photo opportunity, a chance to tweet something about democracy and norms. By all accounts, she thought that's what this was. Another tense but predictable encounter with Donald Trump. Another clash of personalities. Another moment she could turn into political fuel. That expectation matters because it frames everything that followed. When you walk into a room assuming it's a sparring match and discover it's a deposition, the shift is jarring. And that shift is what people still argue about, speculate about, and quietly debate behind closed doors. The president asked about a transcript, not in a way that said you did this, but in a way that said, help me understand this. Anyone who's spent time around lawyers knows that's not a casual phrase. It's an invitation that carries weight, especially when paired with paperwork and people in the room whose job is to remember details for a living. John Ratcliffe, then Director of National Intelligence, was there, silent, holding folders thick enough to suggest preparation, not improvisation. Omar responded the way politicians often do when confronted with specificity. She questioned context, memory, framing. That's not unusual, and it's not inherently damning. Politics runs on selective recall and competing interpretations. The interesting part wasn't the denial. It was what came next. Audio played. Not grainy, not muffled, not the kind of clip that invites endless debate about what was really said. Clear, professional, unmistakable. A voice identified as Omar's speaking about sanctions, influence, coordination, framed in language that raised eyebrows even among people predisposed to give her the benefit of the doubt. Was it advocacy? Diplomacy? Overreach? Or something else entirely? That's where the story becomes less about facts everyone agrees on, and more about lines people draw differently. What does it mean for a member of Congress to speak frequently with foreign officials? Where does constituent advocacy end and policy coordination begin? At what point does empathy for a homeland, a heritage, a community start to blur into something more complicated? Trump didn't answer those questions directly. Instead, he asked more of them. Who is we when you say we? Who exactly is included in our people? Is that phrase rhetorical shorthand, or does it reveal a deeper alignment that deserves scrutiny? You can hear the discomfort in how observers describe that moment, not because an answer was given, but because one wasn't. Silence again filled the room, and silence has a way of being interpreted by whoever's watching. Supporters see restraint, critics see evasion, neutrals see ambiguity, which is often the most dangerous thing in politics. Then came documents, patterns, timelines, not accusations stated as conclusions, but observations laid out like dots on a page. Meetings followed by votes. Statements followed by donations. Communications clustered around key policy moments. None of that proves intent on its own, and any serious person knows correlation isn't causation. But politics isn't a courtroom, and public opinion doesn't wait for verdicts. It reacts to narratives, and patterns feed narratives whether anyone likes it or not. Trump framed it that way, not as a prosecutor delivering charges, but as a businessman pointing at a spreadsheet and saying, "Help me understand why this keeps happening." That framing matters, because it allowed him to stay just on the right side of accusation while still applying pressure. There were references to classified briefings, carefully worded, not claims of leaks, but questions about timing and perception. Could someone reasonably conclude that sensitive insights influenced outside conversations? Was that influence intentional, incidental, or unavoidable given her role and background? Those questions hung in the air, unanswered, and unanswered questions tend to echo. At some point, the conversation shifted from policy to identity. Not in the way cable news often caricatures, but in a quieter, more unsettling way. What does it mean to take an oath? Can loyalty be layered, or does public office demand a singular focus? Is it fair to expect someone to emotionally detach from the place they came from, especially when that place is suffering? These aren't rhetorical traps. They're genuine tensions in a globalized political class. Plenty of lawmakers have heritage ties abroad. Plenty advocate passionately for foreign causes. Most never face this level of scrutiny, which raises another uncomfortable question. Why this case? At this moment? Critics of Trump see weaponization, intimidation, raw power flexing behind closed doors. Supporters see accountability, long overdue, finally applied without fear. Others see something murkier, a collision of personalities, politics, and perception that spiraled beyond anyone's control. The truth, if it exists cleanly at all, likely lives somewhere between those interpretations. When resignation entered the conversation, that's when the tone reportedly changed. Not triumphant, not gloating, but transactional. Options laid out, consequences implied, rather than declared. Resign and step away, or stay and fight, in an environment where every ambiguity would be amplified, dissected, and judged in the harshest light possible. Is that coercion? Or is that politics at its most brutally honest? That depends entirely on where you stand, and where you think power should stop. What's undeniable is that resignation reframed the entire episode. It closed off legal battles before they began, and opened a vacuum filled instantly by speculation. When Omar stood at the podium later and announced her departure, the language was careful. Errors in judgment, reflection, family. No details, no fireworks, no counter-accusations. Just an exit that left more questions than answers. Trump's follow-up remarks were equally measured, at least on the surface. He didn't list charges. He didn't release recordings. He spoke in principles, not particulars about loyalty, responsibility, and lines that shouldn't be crossed. That restraint frustrated critics and satisfied supporters in equal measure. And that's where this story lingers, unresolved. No trial, no exhaustive public record, no definitive conclusion. Just a series of events, interpreted through partisan lenses, each side convinced the other is missing something obvious. Was this the exposure of behavior that crossed an invisible line, or the crushing of a political opponent using the full weight of executive power? Maybe the most uncomfortable takeaway is that both readings can coexist. That's the reality of modern American politics, where facts, feelings, and framing collide daily. Omar's supporters argue she was punished for caring too much, for refusing to compartmentalize identity and policy. Her critics argue she blurred lines that shouldn't be blurred and paid the price. what everyone agrees on, quietly, if not publicly, is that the episode sent a message to lawmakers, to activists, to anyone who believes symbolism can substitute for scrutiny. Whether that message was necessary or dangerous is still up for debate. And maybe that's the point. In a system built on distrust of power, ambiguity is inevitable. The story doesn't end with a verdict. It ends with a warning, depending on who's telling it. About loyalty, about perception, about the cost of assuming you're untouchable in a country that prides itself on questioning everyone. The Oval Office returned to normal after that day. The desk stayed where it always is. The flags didn't move. But for anyone watching closely, something shifted. Not because a crime was proven or innocence established, but because a line was tested, and no one can quite agree on where it actually was. And that's where I keep coming back to the part nobody wants to sit with, because it's not as satisfying as a clean villain story. A resignation without a full public accounting doesn't settle anything. It just freezes the argument in place. People don't stop debating, they just start filling the empty space with whatever they already believed. Supporters call it a takedown, critics call it a shakedown, and the rest of the country shrugs because rent is still due on Friday. But if you're trying to understand how a moment like this happens, you don't start with the podium. You start with the machinery that led to the room. Because here's the uncomfortable question. How do you get from routine political meeting to national security conversation without anyone outside a tiny circle knowing? If you believe the official vibe, it was carefully staged, almost clinical. If you believe the skeptical vibe, it was carefully staged, but for reasons that have more to do with optics than security. Either way, it didn't feel spontaneous, and that matters. Power doesn't do spontaneous when the stakes are existential. What makes it even stranger is the cast. Donald Trump in his element, not on a rally stage but in the role he always preferred. Boss at the end of the hallway. John Ratcliffe in the corner. Quiet. There to signal that this wasn't just political theater. And Ilhan Omar, who has spent years surviving storms by turning every hit into a fundraising email, suddenly facing something she couldn't meme her way out of. That's not a moral judgment, that's just modern politics. If it bleeds, it converts. The public never sees the early steps, so let's talk about them the way people in Washington talk about them, in half sentences and careful nouns. Concerns, flags, patterns, briefings, words that sound boring until you realize they're what people use when they don't want to say the loud part out loud. The loud part is this. Once a narrative hardens inside the national security bubble, it stops behaving like a normal political controversy. It becomes a file, a workflow, an internal story with its own momentum. And by the time it reaches the Oval Office, it's not a question anymore, it's a folder. Now, I'm not claiming those folders prove anything by themselves. I'm saying the existence of a process changes the psychology of everyone involved. If you're the target, you feel hunted. If you're the investigator, you feel righteous. If you're the president, you feel, well, like the sun finally came out, and you can do what presidents are rarely allowed to do. Act like there are consequences again. That feeling can be intoxicating, and it can also be dangerous. And look, it's easy to get lost in the 127 communications number because it sounds like a headline. But the real issue isn't the count, it's the interpretation. If you're Omar's defender, you say that's diplomacy by constituency, a lawmaker staying in touch with people who affect her community. If you're her critic, you say that's a private foreign policy running parallel to the official one. If you're me, watching from the cheap seats, you say, why does Washington always wait until the numbers are huge before it asks the basic question. Why is the first serious conversation always the one that happens when someone's cornered? There's also the vibe of classified, and this is where smart people start talking past each other. Because classified information isn't one thing. Sometimes it's a precise detail that can hurt someone if it leaks. Sometimes it's a broad assessment that half the town already suspects. Sometimes it's less about the content and more about who had access and who repeated what after. And the people who don't work around it tend to assume it's either a smoking gun or a meaningless stamp, when the truth is usually messier than either. So when Trump is described as pushing the timeline question, briefing, then contact, then statement, he's not necessarily proving anything. He's building a frame. And once you've framed someone as too close, every ordinary thing they do starts looking like evidence to someone who's already decided. That's why these situations can be so corrosive, even if no one ever crosses a legal line. Because the process itself becomes punishment, reputationally, psychologically, politically. And that brings us back to what happened after the resignation. Because if you thought the story ended with a signature, you haven't watched American politics long enough. The signature is just the bell that starts the next round. Within hours, people were digging through old clips the way they always do, like archaeologists who already know what they want to find. Every speech about Somalia got replayed with new captions. Every photo with a diplomat got treated like a confession. Every donation got circled in red, like we were all suddenly accountants. And it didn't matter whether those things were benign in context, because context is the first thing to die when the internet smells blood. Then came the inside sources, which is Washington's favorite genre. Anonymous staffers, unnamed officials, friends of friends, everyone claiming they heard something. Some said she was targeted for being a high-profile Muslim progressive. Some said the government had been sitting on concerns for years and finally acted. Some said the president wanted a trophy, a public scalp. Some said the intelligence world wanted a precedent. Don't freelancing lawmakers make their job harder? And if you're looking for a single clean explanation, good luck, because Washington doesn't do single explanations. Meanwhile, Minnesota politics went into an emergency mode, a special election talk. Party leaders scrambling, donors calling, consultants salivating. Because politics is always hungry, and a vacancy is a buffet. The same people who would talk about democracy on camera would talk about opportunity off camera. And you can call that cynical, but it's also just the system being the system. A seat opens, and the machine rolls forward, regardless of how messy the opening was. Omar's allies demanded transparency. Her opponents demanded accountability. Cable news demanded ratings. And the public, as usual, got the version that was most emotionally satisfying rather than most informative. Because emotional satisfaction is the real currency here. It's why a resignation without details can feel like a win to one side and a cover-up to the other. Ambiguity is a Rorschach test, and America took it like a final exam. But here's the piece people don't talk about enough. What happens when you remove a politician from the board without litigating the reasons in daylight? You don't just remove the person, you remove the chance for the public to learn anything real about the boundaries. You don't get a clear lesson like, this is the rule, this is the evidence, this is the standard. You get a foggy lesson like, don't get caught, or worse, don't get targeted. And both lessons are poison in their own way. Because if Omar truly crossed lines, again, I'm not stating that as fact, I'm saying if, then the country deserved a clean, public explanation of what the lines were. And if she didn't, if she was pressured out through a mix of insinuation and leverage, then the country deserved that explanation too. In either case, The public deserved something more than a statement read at a podium and a shrug toward classified. That's why people keep circling back to the Oval Office scene itself. Not just because it's dramatic, but because it's the only part of the story that feels tangible. A room, a desk, a tone, a person confronted with documents and questions. Everything after that is whispers. And whispers are addictive because they let you believe whatever you want with zero inconvenience. And then, inevitably, the story spilled into the broader culture war. Some framed it as loyalty versus disloyalty, as if human beings are binary switches. Some framed it as race and religion versus power, as if institutions only ever move for one reason. Some framed it as corruption versus accountability, as if those words mean the same thing to everyone. And the truth is, all of those frames are partial, and partial frames are what keep the audience arguing. Because if the audience ever agrees, the show is over. At some point, you could feel the mood shift from "what happened" to "what does this mean for everyone else?" That's when lawmakers started watching their own phones a little closer. That's when staffers started rewriting meeting memos with extra caution. That's when routine calls with foreign officials suddenly didn't feel routine anymore, even for people who'd been doing them for years. And that's when the story stopped being about Ilhan Omar and started being about the unspoken rules of Washington. Because Washington has always had unofficial rules that everyone pretends don't exist. Rules about who can advocate for what. Rules about how close is too close. Rules about which foreign causes are noble and which are suspicious. Rules about which lawmakers get assumed patriotic and which ones have to prove it every morning before coffee. Nobody writes these rules down, but everybody enforces them anyway. So you can see why this episode landed like a shockwave. Not because it definitively proved something, but because it reminded everyone how fragile their assumptions are. The assumption that fame equals protection. The assumption that outrage equals immunity. The assumption that you can live in permanent conflict mode and never run into a room where someone has paper, patience, and leverage. And yes, there was gallows humor in it too, because America can't resist that. People joked that the Oval Office had become a reality show again, like the desk was a set and the folders were props. People joked that the only thing missing was a commercial break and a voting app. But that humor is a mask. It's how people cope with the idea that political life can turn on a single meeting, and the public may never learn the full story. And here's the part I can't stop thinking about. If you're a citizen watching this, what are you supposed to do with it? You can't verify the recordings. You can't read the full evidence. You can't measure the context. You're handed a resignation and a set of competing narratives, and then you're expected to pick a side like it's a sports rivalry. That's not democracy at its best. That's democracy as a mood. And yet, even with all that, the story didn't fade. Because the more someone says no details, the more the public assumes the details are the whole point. The more someone says move on, the more people dig in. And the longer Omar stayed silent, the more her silence became its own kind of evidence to whoever already disliked her, and its own kind of martyrdom to whoever already loved her. So the question became, what happens next? Does she vanish into private life, as the statement implied? Does she re-emerge later with her version carefully framed, carefully lawyered, carefully human? Does the administration ever feel pressure to release anything more, even in partial form? Or does the story become another permanent unresolved file in America's mental cabinet, labeled probably, maybe, and I heard? And if you're Donald Trump in this scenario, again, speaking in terms of political logic, not moral endorsement, What's the incentive to release more? If your goal was to remove a political adversary and send a message about allegiance, you already achieved it. If your goal was to rally your base, the ambiguity helps. If your goal was to avoid a legal fight that could backfire, the silence helps even more. Sometimes the most effective move in politics is not proving your case beyond doubt, but leaving just enough shadow that your opponent can't stand fully in the light again. That's the modern trap. Not prison bars, not courtroom drama, but permanent suspicion. A person can beat an allegation, but it's harder to beat a vibe. And in a media ecosystem that runs on vibes, being stuck in suspicion is its own sentence. So when people ask why this episode still gets talked about, it's not because everyone suddenly became a constitutional scholar. It's because it touched a nerve that's bigger than one politician. It touched the nerve of dual identity in public office, the nerve of how we define loyalty in a country of immigrants, the nerve of whether institutions can investigate without becoming political weapons, and the nerve of whether powerful people can force outcomes without ever satisfying the public's need for clarity. That's why the Oval Office scene keeps replaying in people's minds. Not because it was the final word, but because it was the one moment where the power dynamic was visible. And once you see that dynamic, you start asking yourself a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. In a system like this, how many careers end not with proof, but with pressure? How many people survive not because they're innocent, but because they're protected? How many people fall not because they're guilty, but because they're exposed? And then, as if the story needed one more twist, whispers started circulating about other lawmakers. Not names you can say confidently, just the kind of vague chatter that spreads because it can't be disproven. Another one is under review. More files exist. Foreign contacts are being mapped. Briefing room gossip says the intelligence community is tired of freelancing. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was just fear talking. But fear has political consequences even when it's wrong, because fear changes behavior. Fear makes people self-censor. Fear makes people back away from causes that might look controversial later. Fear makes the ambitious quiet, and it makes the cynical bold. And once fear enters the bloodstream of a political class, you don't need to arrest anyone to reshape the whole building. You just need enough uncertainty to make everyone wonder if their phone is the next one that becomes a pattern. And that's where this story stops being a scandal and becomes a mirror. A mirror of what we reward. A mirror of what we tolerate. A mirror of how fast hero becomes suspect, depending on which channel you're watching. A mirror of how American politics can turn a complicated human life into a single word, a single label, a single storyline. The sad part is, we don't even agree on what lesson we're supposed to learn. Some people saw it as a victory for accountability. Some saw it as a warning about power. Some saw it as confirmation of everything they already believed about Ilhan Omar. Some saw it as confirmation of everything they already believed about Donald Trump. And the rest of the country saw it as another chapter in a book that never ends, written by people who don't have to live with the consequences. But the consequences are real, even if the evidence stays sealed. A seat changed hands. A movement lost a voice. A president gained a message. A political tribe gained new ammunition. And the public gained one more reason to distrust whatever it's told, no matter who's telling it. And if you're thinking, okay, but what's the truth? Welcome to the club. The truth is often the part nobody is allowed to see. And in this case, the truth became less important than the effect. Because the effect is what reshaped the landscape. The effect is what made every other lawmaker wonder how close is too close. The effect is what made every voter pick a side without ever seeing the full file. And the effect is what brings us back to that next moment in the story. The moment after the cameras shut off, when the West Wing returned to its normal hum, and the people who were in that room had to decide what they were going to do with what they'd just witnessed. Because if there's one thing Washington understands better than ideology, it's leverage. And once leverage exists, it doesn't stay contained. And leverage, once introduced, has a way of changing the temperature of every room it enters, even the ones that pretend nothing happened. The West Wing kept moving. Staffers kept walking fast, with folders tucked under their arms. Phones kept buzzing. Meetings kept starting on time. Outwardly, nothing broke stride. Inwardly, people recalibrated. That's how Washington absorbs shocks, not with sirens, but with subtle shifts in posture. The people who had been closest to the situation didn't need instructions. They understood instinctively what moments like this are for. Some saw a warning sign and backed away from anything that could later be framed as complicated. Some saw an opening and leaned in harder, figuring that silence creates vacuum and vacuum rewards whoever fills it first. And some simply took notes, because the smartest people in this town always take notes when power flexes quietly. What's fascinating is how fast the conversation stopped being about Ilhan Omar as a person. Within days, her name became shorthand, a symbol more than an individual. She pulled an Omar. You don't want to end up like Omar. That issue could get Omar'd if you're not careful. That's when you know a story has crossed the line from scandal into folklore. And folklore doesn't care about nuance. It doesn't ask whether the original event was fairly interpreted. It just packages the moral and passes it along. In this case, the moral depended entirely on who was telling it. To some, it was about loyalty and lines. To others, it was about intimidation and selective enforcement. To most people outside the bubble, it was just another reminder that Washington plays by rules no one ever fully explains. Inside Congress, conversations shifted tone. Meetings with foreign officials didn't stop, but they got more formal, more documented, more cautious. Staffers sat in more meetings than before, not because they were needed, but because witnesses matter. Emails got longer. Calendars got cleaner. The phrase, "for the record," started appearing in places it never had before. That alone tells you something. If nothing improper had ever been possible, there would be no need for that adjustment. And if everything improper had already been happening everywhere, the adjustment wouldn't matter. The truth is probably somewhere in between, where most political behavior lives. Comfortable gray zones that stay gray until someone decides to shine a light, or at least point a flashlight and ask questions. And the questions didn't stop, even if the answers did. Reporters kept calling sources who suddenly stopped returning calls. FOIA requests went out and came back thin. Think pieces multiplied, each one claiming to explain what really happened, usually by reinforcing whatever belief the writer already held. The story became less about discovery and more about confirmation. Trump, for his part, didn't revisit it publicly. That was a choice, not an oversight. He understood something his critics often underestimate. Unresolved stories linger longer than resolved ones. A press conference clears the air. Silence lets the air thicken. By saying just enough and then stepping back, he let everyone else do the work for him. His allies framed it as proof that the system finally worked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but effectively. They argued that if a lawmaker resigns rather than contest the facts in public, that says something on its own. They didn't say what it said. They just let the implication hang. Implication is cheaper than evidence and often more powerful. His opponents saw something else entirely. They saw a president exploiting secrecy to force an outcome without accountability. They asked why, if the concerns were so serious, the public couldn't see more. They asked whether this was about national security or political dominance. And they asked those questions loudly, even though they knew the answers weren't coming. That disconnect between what people demand and what institutions are willing to give is where trust erodes. Because democracy doesn't just run on outcomes, it runs on explanation. When explanation disappears behind the word classified, citizens are left guessing whether that word is protecting the country or protecting power. And once people start guessing, cynicism fills the gap. There's also the human element that gets lost when stories turn symbolic. Whatever you think of Ilhan Omar politically, she didn't vanish into abstraction. She had staffers who lost jobs overnight. She had constituents who woke up without the representative they voted for. She had children who watched their parent become a national argument. None of that proves anything, but it complicates the urge to treat the episode like a chess move. And complication is uncomfortable, which is why it rarely survives the news cycle intact. It's easier to flatten a person into a lesson than to sit with the mess of their reality. Easier to say, "This is what happens when," than to ask, "What does this tell us about how the system actually works?" But if you care about the system, that second question matters more. Because if the takeaway is simply "don't get caught," then nothing improved. If the takeaway is "don't challenge power," then something broke. And if the takeaway is "be clear about where advocacy ends and obligation begins," then maybe something constructive emerged, even if the process was ugly. The problem is, no one ever officially articulated which takeaway was intended. So lawmakers were left to infer it themselves. And inference breeds inconsistency. Some pulled back from international advocacy altogether. Some doubled down, daring anyone to try the same move again. Some quietly asked lawyers to review years of emails they'd never worried about before. None of those reactions suggest confidence. They suggest recalibration under uncertainty. And uncertainty in politics is a form of control. When the rules feel vague, people self-police more aggressively than any external authority ever could. They avoid risks not because they're illegal, but because they might be reinterpreted later. That's efficient for institutions and stifling for representation. And again, whether you see that as good or bad depends on what you fear more: abuse of power or abuse of office. Meanwhile, outside Washington, the story hardened into something simpler. Social media reduced it to memes and slogans. Talk radio reduced it to morality plays. Late-night comedy reduced it to punchlines that avoided specifics but leaned hard on tone. The nuance never stood a chance, because nuance doesn't travel well. And that's where the irony sits. The very people most invested in transparency often consumed the least transparent version of the story. The very people most skeptical of power often trusted whichever version confirmed their suspicion. The very people most confident in their moral clarity often ignored how little they actually knew. This wasn't a failure of information, it was a failure of patience. Time passed, as it always does. New controversies arrived, new villains, new heroes, new emergencies. But this one didn't fully disappear. It stayed lodged in the background, referenced whenever loyalty, foreign policy, or identity came up. It became precedent without being precedent, warning without being rule. And that may be the most consequential part of all, because precedents that aren't written are the hardest to challenge. You can't argue against a statute that doesn't exist. You can't appeal a process that was never formalized. You can only react, adjust, and hope you're reading the room correctly. So when future lawmakers think twice before making a call, or taking a meeting, or speaking too plainly about a foreign issue tied to their heritage, this moment will be part of that hesitation. Not because it definitively proved wrongdoing, but because it demonstrated how fast perception can harden into consequence when the right forces align. And perception, once weaponized, doesn't need certainty to be effective. The Oval Office, in that sense, wasn't just a setting. It was a signal. A reminder that the distance between debate and decision can be very short when power decides its time. And whether you see that as reassuring or alarming probably says more about your trust in the people holding that power than about the person who lost it. Which brings the story back to the only honest place it can end, at least for now. Not with a verdict, not with a confession carved in stone, but with a question that refuses to go away. In a political system built on representation, secrecy, ambition, and fear, how much ambiguity can it survive before the ambiguity becomes the point? Because once ambiguity becomes the point, everyone loses something.